This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to academic and writer Will Scheibel, who has written a book on Gene Tierney, star of Hollywood's home front. Tierney is a star of many classic films, including Leave Her to Heaven, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, and Laura, but Will uses his study to go behind the scenes of the Hollywood star-making machine and the publicity surrounding celebrity, as well as the performances and the films themselves. It's a really interesting book, very deep, very detailed, and it really shines a light not just on the individual of Gene Tierney, but I think a lot of people will enjoy it if they're interested in that period at all. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to like and subscribe. You can also follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. Before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
I'm doing well. Yeah, it's a snowy day in Syracuse, New York. So pretty typical for February. It took a while for winter to kick in, but it's finally here. How about yourself?
Right. So Syracuse, what's that like? How close are you to sort of New York City, Manhattan?
It's about 4 hours from the city.
Right.
So it's pretty much like central New York.
Right. New York State. Because I never think, when you say Syracuse, New York, I'm thinking, oh, well, that must be just outside the city, but obviously not.
It's the borough that nobody's ever heard of. Yeah.
Right.
No,
is it quite a rural area?
Not quite rural. I mean, there are rural areas around Syracuse, but it's a mid-sized city. The university's here, Syracuse University, which is where I work. The Upstate Hospital is here, so yeah, it's a fairly urban campus.
How have you been there long, or?
So yeah, I started in 2015. So I guess now I'm no longer sort of a new Syracusan, but it definitely feels like home. Yeah, I started in fall of 2015, about a year after I defended my dissertation.
Right. And so where did you do your dissertation?
I was a PhD student at Indiana University in Bloomington, and was there for about 7 years, and then started on the tenure track at Syracuse University in 2015, and I'm going up for full professor this year. So I'm definitely kind of planting my feet firmly on the ground.
Oh, good. Well, best of luck with that.
Thanks.
And so your academic work is I could tell from reading your book, you're approaching film from an academic point of view. How did you sort of get into that as a sort of study path?
I was a film studies and journalism double major in college at the University of Iowa. And at first I thought I wanted to be like a film reviewer, a sort of popular film critic. And the more I was taking the film history classes and film analysis classes at Iowa for my second major, the more I got interested in that kind of writing about film, sort of long essays and research. And so I thought, I might want to stick with this longer. So I've always been a cinephile, like a dyed-in-the-wool cinephile since I was a kid. So, thinking about movies was in some ways not new. It was just like a sort of formalized version of what I was already doing in my like non-academic life of just, watching movies, collecting movies, reading about movies. So I don't see like a clear separation in some ways between my academic life and my personal life. The administrative stuff is definitely academic, not personal, but the sort of, film history and film analysis stuff is what I, enjoy thinking about anyway. So I thought, I might want to stick with this, and went to grad school at Indiana University, which has a really great film history program, and the rest, I guess, is history.
And when you sort of started to become a cinephile as a kid, what were the sort of films that you were inspiring you? What were the things which are getting you excited?
Yeah, so I was a teenager in like the late 90s, early 2000s, and so there were some exciting movies that were new at that time. And I remember there was sort of a moment in the late 90s for neo noir, movies like Memento and LA Confidential, and this sort of revival of film noir, that films that were very self-conscious about the history of film noir. And so those movies led me back to noir from the 40s and 50s. And so I really got into classic Hollywood film vis-a-vis film noir, and certain directors that were associated with noir and horror and melodrama. And so my cinephilia was very much tied to a kind of mid-century classic Hollywood genre filmmaking and director-driven filmmaking, and usually, films featuring, like a lot of those films from that period, dynamic star personalities. So, when thinking about what kind of research do I want to do for the long haul in grad school, I thought, go back to the material that I've always been interested in, which is that period. And it seemed like a period that would have lots of avenues to explore historically. So, but I mean, I like films from all over the world. I like contemporary films, art films, experimental films, documentary. But in terms of the sort of movies that I enjoy writing about, tend to be popular narrative films from the United States.
I mean, yeah, film noir, I think, I remember that period you're speaking of so well. The sort of the usual suspects came out out then, and there were lots of sort of, I think, a little bit inspired by Tarantino, sort of. I mean, I'm not necessarily inspired by, but perhaps maybe they just were able to get funding. I'm thinking sort of something like Red Rock West with Nicolas Cage, the John Dahl film. Yeah, which I don't think is really inspired by Tarantino, or I think he's doing his own thing. But I'm absolutely certain when they went into the meeting, they said it'll be like Reservoir Dogs, but in Texas.
Exactly. Yeah, it seemed like there was this sort of perfect storm of things happening. It was that American independent cinema of the 90s that was gravitating towards crime films, or films that were very, clever and self-conscious about their own knowledge of film history. The Coen brothers films are like that too, I think. And then there was the reprinting of old detective novels as well. Vintage was republishing, Dashiell Hammett and James M. Cain, and Jim Thompson was sort of a figure who was in the shadow, if I can use a noir metaphor, in the shadow of Hammett and Cain and Chandler. But in the 80s and 90s, there was this big revival of interest in Jim Thompson's work. So I think a lot of those films that were coming out were direct adaptations of his work that was suddenly being, rediscovered.
Oh man, I used to buy those Jim Thompson I was in England at the time, I was in Liverpool at the time, and I'd buy you could only really get imports because I don't think there was any British printing of his books. Picador, I think, did like a 4-novel omnibus, but if you wanted anything outside of the most popular, The Getaway or Killer Inside Me, you had to sort of find these, and they were like 25 pounds, which at the time was a lot for a paperback, essentially. But I must have spent a lot of student loans on those books. So this leads us to Gene Tierney, who is am I mispronouncing her name? Gene Tierney.
Gene Tierney. Yep, you're correct.
Yeah. Who is one of those stars. I don't know. I mean, I'm wondering how famous she is in America compared to, because I know her, and I know Laura, and I've seen her in the Douglas Sirk films. But she's not someone on the sort of Rita Hayworth or Lauren Bacall scale of fame. But maybe that's because of my European perspective. How is it on your side of the pond?
No, I think that's fairly similar to how she would be remembered, I guess, at the present in the United States. And that's partly why I want to write about her. Is she isn't quite as canonical a star as, say, Rita Hayworth or Barbara Stanwyck or Joan Crawford or Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn. You know, these stars that we associate with what Richard Dyer calls the independent woman type. You know, both on and off the screen, their star persona was, you know, larger than life, really powerful female characters and personalities. And there was for a long time, I think it's starting to change now. For a long time, there was this perception that Gene Tierney was a weak actress and you know, wasn't in the same league as those other names that I mentioned from about the same period. But she is, her face and her image is ubiquitous in the kind of cultural memory of classical Hollywood. So she's not thought of as, you know, one of the greatest actresses of that generation, but she is a very familiar face. And part of that is because of the enormous popularity of Laura, not only when it was first released, but it's in its afterlife. It had a lot of play on television. And it's been an intertextual site. There have been so many films and TV shows that have paid homage to Laura and referenced Laura, and that the Laura portrait that is so central to that story has circulated in a way that has given a kind of prolonged visibility to Gene Tierney. So people know her from that period. They know the name, they know the face. They identify her with film noir. As you said, she was in a number of 20th Century Fox noir films from the period, but they don't really know either they don't really know too much about her, or they do, and they sort of say, oh, well, she was like a kind of second string classic Hollywood figure. Now, there are classic Hollywood fans who, like myself, you know, would totally disagree with that. And so I thought, well, that's interesting that there's this kind of tension between the received wisdom about Gene Tierney and then for, you know, people who are really interested in classical Hollywood, that she remains this kind of favorite. And so I thought, I wonder, you know, how was she received at the time that Laura and Leave Her to Heaven and The Ghost and Mrs. Muir were coming out. And so in thinking about her in that historical context of the 1940s, what was interesting to me is that her films were hugely popular. Laura was a hit. Leave Her to Heaven was an even bigger hit. Dragonwyck. And she was all over the fan magazines. 20th Century Fox had this big buildup for her as, you know, one of their great new discoveries of the early 1940s. Darryl F. Zanuck famously called her the most beautiful woman in movie history. So I thought it's interesting that people did respond to her films. And so I was trying to think about, you know, why that is and what was significant about her in the context of the 1940s that may have been forgotten over time, where people remember the Laura portrait and think like, oh, she was this very sort of passive star and, you know, better known for her beauty than her talent is kind of the refrain that you sometimes hear. But it's interesting that Laura, the film, is all about disputing that very myth. It's about kind of deconstructing that image of the woman who is the object of a man's possession. And in the case of Laura, it's like three different men that are sort of vying for control over her. And so trying to kind of work backwards from that and to figure out like, well, you know, how does that square with her popularity in the 1940s? In the 1940s, she was seen as this like active participant in Hollywood promoting the war effort, and after World War II, very much invested in playing these ordinary women.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that I found really interesting about the book is it's not like a straight biography. It's more about an anatomy of stardom, and the fact that it isn't this, it isn't. I was going to say Kathleen Turner then, Catherine Hepburn, or Ingrid Bergman or someone like that, who as you would say, okay, they're absolutely name recognition, face recognition internationally. She's more of a, I don't know who I would put in that second string, because it's difficult, because I mean, I think of people like, say, Gloria Graham or maybe Miriam Hopkins, but then I think, well, Miriam Hopkins was massive in her time, so I'm not sure. But you sort of, you use her case as a way of sort of seeing how Hollywood builds up these stars and how they're put together, and then how their own personal lives or how their own performances can sort of not necessarily fit the mold and not necessarily consistently achieve, what those other people have achieved, even though, as you say, she kind of had a lot of powerful people trying to make that happen.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Because I worked really hard to make that clear. So I'm glad that came through in the book. But yeah, I was interested in just the kind of complicated and dynamic machinery of star making, and what happens when the star narrative is no longer capable of being tightly controlled by the studio system, and what happens when star performances may be in tension with the conception of the star that the studio had, and how there are these kind of competing voices. Like, one of the interesting things about writing on Laura was how many different people had a different sense of who Laura was in the making of the film. And of course, that's literally what the film is about. And then Gene Tierney has her own conception of the character. But the later part of her career, she was, hugely popular in the middle of the 1940s. And then by the early 1950s, she was making film after film. She was more active than ever before. And then immediately she kind of disappears in 1954, 1955. She disappears from the public eye, and then doesn't come back until the late 1950s, when it's revealed that she was undergoing treatment for psychiatric disorders, what now likely would be classified as a bipolar disorder. And this was happening while she was going in and out of psychiatric institutions. The press was covering this, and people were kind of watching it firsthand, which is somewhat unusual for that time, because a lot of the stars who faced who were dealing with mental health issues, that was revealed after the fact. People would sort of read back on, like, oh wow, that's interesting that so and so was going through that. Or it was like a star like Frances Farmer, who didn't have the star power of Gene Tierney, so she wasn't kind of an A-list star. So Gene Tierney is unique in that way, where she was outspoken about what she was going through, and people were reading about this as it was happening. At one point, she reemerged from a psychiatric care to work as a sales lady in a Topeka clothing store in Topeka, Kansas. So I thought that was interesting, and that was unique, and that was something that obviously the studio didn't have control over. So how the studio attempted to respond to that, I found very interesting, in trying to say, well, this is Gene Tierney's big comeback. We'll sort of turn this into a comeback narrative, which is eliding the very problem, which is the mental health concerns and resources to support people with mental illness. That is the one thing they weren't really talking about. It's like, oh, she was just kind of heartbroken over her relationships that had dissolved by this point, and framing it more as a woman with a broken heart who just had to kind of power through by continuing to work, as opposed to dealing with the systemic issue of mental health.
Yeah, and there's got to be a sort of end point to that narrative, a happy ending, which is not necessarily, well, as you say, it might be part of the problem, having that pressure towards a perceived happy ending.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess the happy ending in some ways is that her films still, not all of them, but, the really popular ones from the 1940s continue to circulate on classic movie channels, on DVD and Blu-ray. And there is she's a beloved figure, albeit maybe within a more kind of niche audience of cinephiles and classic movie buffs. There's, social media pages dedicated to her. So, people, do recognize that she was an important figure at that time, and people still love Laura and love Leave Her to Heaven. But it's a shame that in some ways the sort of like the Gene Tierney, the tragic victim, I think has eclipsed a lot of her career. And as I tried to argue in the book, that's sort of a different way of talking about her in passive terms. Like on the one hand, she's the most beautiful woman in movie history who isn't very talented, but is beautiful to look at. And then on the other hand, she's this, poor, broken-hearted woman who just didn't have the strength to, carry on under the trying conditions of her personal life, and was just exhausted. And so, but nevertheless, has the sort of fighting spirit to kind of continue on. So both of those are two different ways of thinking about her in very passive terms. And so I wanted to try to recuperate some kind of agency or subjectivity there within the limited ways that I could, of obviously not knowing her, having access to, her personal letters and things. I used her autobiography, her self-published, or her not self-published. The book is called Self-Portrait, but she published an autobiography in the late 70s that gave some insights.
It was interesting when I was reading, because it was making me very much think of how this book arrives in a moment where we are having a conversation about stardom and about female, on the one side, victimization, perhaps, on the other side, exploitation, and thinking specifically about how Blonde last year, kind of ignited a debate, which seemed personally to me, and I'm very aware now we're two guys discussing Blonde and female, but it struck me as being it was like there was Blonde really struck me as like a first wave of feminism movie. So that it was all about the woman as a victim, and the criticism of it was from a lot of people who quite rightly to some degree were coming at it from, we've had that first wave of feminism where we see the woman as victim, and now we want to see the woman as an agent and in some ways empowered. In a way, those are both narratives, and you kind of have to, lie. As I was reading your book, I was just thinking how a life doesn't necessarily just slot into an easy narrative.
Yeah, and I was trying to walk that line of not taking a meta approach to the narratives that had been written about Gene Tierney, and trying not to write my own narrative on top of that. But yeah, I finished the book well before I knew about the Blonde. Well, the Blonde movie, that's been that was a movie they were trying to get off the ground for a long time, but I had no idea that the book would come out right before Blondes. Otherwise, I might have mentioned something about that in the conclusion, because I think it does bring up all sorts of interesting things for, the way that star images are constructed and continue to be reconstructed long after the life of the star. And Blonde is a perfect example of that with Marilyn Monroe. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about what you thought of the film. I have not read the the Joyce Carol Oates novel that the movie's based on. But I had a lot of problems with the movie. And it wasn't because I wanted to see, Marilyn Monroe, the like, unproblematically empowered star, because in some ways she wasn't empowered working in the Hollywood studio system of the 1950s. I mean, there were all sorts of limitations on stars like Marilyn Monroe, but I found it to be a film that was just kind of reveling in the spectacle of her struggles rather than providing any kind of insights into the conditions under which those struggles were taking place. And that might have been the film that I personally would have wanted to see. And that's a problem with biographies, I think, because biographies are written in a way that, you're trying to give a narrative to a life. And I know Blonde is not, strictly speaking, a biography. It's a, sort of creative interpretation inspired by Marilyn Monroe, but it's the film anyway is doing some of the similar things that biographies do. And I feel like just rendering her into this kind of punching bag, I didn't think was productive. But I'm curious, if you don't mind me asking, did you feel similarly, or did you?
No, I don't mind you asking at all. It's with a sense of trepidation that I offer my it's just social media has rendered this kind of conversation sometimes a little bit. But anyway, this is what I think. I thought it worked as a sort of compulsion style horror movie. In which she is literally sort of haunted by her own creation. Marilyn Monroe becomes the sort of Frankenstein's monster to her Norma Jean, and I find it incredibly sort of powerful and immersive, and just the way it looked, the way it felt. But at the same time, I'm very aware that I would get angry with a film that maybe didn't have so much panache, taking so many liberties with fact. And I know it's Joyce Carol Oates wrote the novel as a novel and was very distinct about that. And I thought Andrew Dominik's argument that he didn't put a disclaimer at the front of the film as, oh well, people should understand, and I thought he would have saved himself a lot of trouble if he'd just done that. It would just like, look, it's an imagining. If it's an imagining, then fine. And to tell you the truth, I mean, a lot of the trouble that people have with the whole with Blonde in particular, I agree. I think it's a problem with Hollywood biopics in general, that there's this very simplistic Freudian, Freud in terms of psychoanalysis is kind of the dodo now. He's considered a better literary critic than he is a psychiatrist. I don't mean that facetiously. I mean, he really, he writes very well on Hamlet, and and he's applying kind of like those sort of observations to a topography of the mind, which is based on seeing the world from above the clouds. You don't see, I can't see where the mountains are because I can't see brain activity, and now we can. It's not his fault. But from Orson Welles and Rosebud on, we've had this model of human life in Hollywood, which is all we need to do is find the rosebud, and it's always one thing, and it's always childhood, and it's always to do with a mum, and it's just kind of, so that in itself is just such a restrictive and dull way of looking at. Sorry, it's a very long answer.
No, I think that's really well said. Yeah. And that's really interesting. I had a problem with that kind of Freudian the way it purports to kind of explain certain things in sort of traditional Freudian terms, especially at the beginning with her childhood. And I also had a problem with, and I realized this is sort of extra textual information, but my reaction to the film was somewhat visceral, after I watched it, and I'd heard, about the controversies and everything, but the things about the film that put me off in a strong enough way that I was just curious to read more about the film, which is not always what happens when I don't love a film. Sometimes I'll just be like, oh, that's done. But I was intrigued by just what Andrew Dominik was thinking when he made the film. I love The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford, which is a film he made, I think is like 2 films earlier than Blonde. And I think that's a fascinating film about celebrity and myth making. So I was in some ways kind of rooting for the film based on Jesse James, but then hearing him talk about Marilyn Monroe in such dismissive terms, there's a famous, I guess now kind of infamous interview that was circulating on social media where he was talking about, oh, well, her films are terrible. I mean, I'm paraphrasing it, but nobody cares about Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and whether the film is directly based on Marilyn Monroe as a straightforward biopic or just kind of inspired by Marilyn Monroe, that seemed like a bad faith premise to me, to make a film about somebody that he didn't even care about, and was more interested in just this Freudian narrative that it sounds like he identified with, but wasn't really concerned about whether or not that was an adequate exploration of Monroe.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I know the interview which he did himself no favors throughout. Absolutely no favors at all. And it just baffles me that he spent something like 20 years bringing that to the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you dedicate such a long period, so much of your own capital as well? Because directors don't get a chance to make films frequently. So why would you expend so much of that on someone that you don't think had, the root of their talent wasn't even there? And
exactly,
just for the record, he's totally wrong. Marilyn Monroe is a hugely talented actress,
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just from what was it, All About Eve? She turns up in a small role in All About Eve, and she just immediately burns a hole in the screen, and it's amazing,
Yeah, and going back to Noir, my favorite of her films, favorite of her performances, at least if I were asked that question right at this moment, I would say Don't Bother to Knock, which was her first, not her first film, but her first starring role in which she's, the lead. And it really shows that she had a range beyond the kind of 50s sex comedies. And I think she's fantastic in Some Like It Hot and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and 7 Year Itch. But
even in Niagara, which is her playing a much more straightforwardly noirish villain, really,
Oh, Niagara, is that? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think she did have a range that still in some ways hasn't been fully appreciated, because I think when people talk about her films, they talk about the same couple of films over and over again. But Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which is the very film that Dominik cites, is like a perfect example of how untrue that statement is, because that's such a for the time, like a pretty subversive performance.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Just like, man, which does give credence to that bad faith reading of the film, that he's just seen certain visual images that he wants to reproduce, and he wants to give them a sort of punkish, glaring sort of effect. And I do get that. I just felt there was something in it that affected me as I was watching it. I'm not sure if it had anything to do with Marilyn Monroe. And I know a previous guest, Sam Wasson, got very agitated and angry, and kind of, I totally get that, totally rightfully angry, in terms of the rape scene with the studio head, because as far as he was concerned, as well as, the various, just the whole idea of how we depict rape these days, but also he was like, that never happened. That's actionable. That's a lie. That's not true. That's totally, and he saw it as sort of a corrosive view of Hollywood as well, that Hollywood is this place where this is this happens everywhere. And yet in the post-Weinstein world, that's all too credible. But at the same time, if everybody's doing it, is anybody particularly bad? If it's so, if it's so universal, whereas that idea that it's universal actually kind of provides cover for the individuals who are doing this.
Right. Yeah. And that the studio head in that scene is Daryl Zanuck, who is that Monroe, like Gene Tierney, also worked for Fox, and so there's an interesting kind of connection there in some ways with the Fox's continued interest in a certain kind of so-called sex symbol, and Zanuck was famous for these I guess they call it casting couch. There's some kind of euphemism for Zanuck's reputation, which at the time I think was he was sort of seen as like a ladies' man, and I think that is also kind of covering up the insidiousness of what was going on behind his office doors. I don't know, personally, I haven't done enough research on Marilyn Monroe to know about the nature of his relationship with Monroe. But yeah, I mean, that scene, it did feel gratuitous to me, early on in the film. And, I mean, especially because, we know that this did go on and does go on. I wasn't sure why they needed to just sort of have yet another, I guess at that point, the film is sort of one of the first of many scenes of Monroe being, graphically degraded.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, bringing it back to Tierney and your book, because we don't want to wander too long in the swamp of Andrew Dominik's imagination. And I have a lot of admiration for the man. I love his other films, and I've interviewed him in the past, and is a fascinating.
Oh wow!
He is he's a man from a certain era, I think, with a certain mindset, and he's not. That interview was a real showcase of someone not really listening, not really,
exactly. Yeah.
I think there was a defense to be made of the film, but it did require some, okay, I see what you mean, but, it was like, no, I don't see what you mean at all, But returning to Tierney and her status, because what's interesting, I found, well, there were two aspects that I'd like to sort of get you to expand on a little bit for our listeners. Sure. One is the way that she sort of goes from playing ethnic roles of a sort of Oriental nature and constructed, and then has to sort of somehow get out of that because it's a little bit of a cul-de-sac. And the other is how then that goes into the Second World War and her changing into this sort of propaganda. I don't think propaganda role of helping the war effort.
Yeah, so I was sort of drawing from Edward Said and his theory of what he calls Orientalism, which is this kind of Western fascination with the East in this very homogenized way. And so on the one hand, there's this attraction to what seems like a quote unquote exotic culture. And then at the same time, kind of embedded with that, there's this sort of fear of that or anxiety over it. And the anxiety and the fear of the racial otherness also motivates the kind of attraction to it. And so that gets kind of built up into or built into a certain kind of star image that still exists in popular culture, but was prevalent in the 1920s and 1930s of the quote unquote Orientalist exotic. And the initial attempts to build up Tierney as a sex symbol were in these terms, and she was in Joseph von Sternberg's The Shanghai Gesture. She was in a movie called Sundown, in which she actually appeared in the same costume in that film on the cover of Life magazine in 1941, which was like a sort of big moment for announcing her as a new star and, a star who represented certain ideas about or attitudes towards feminine beauty. And then when the war, those films were not well received by critics, and I don't know that the negative reception would reflect the way that those movies would be negatively received now. I think now the negative reception would call attention to the racist underpinnings of that star image. I think at the time people just saw it as like melodramatic claptrap. So Fox needed to kind of reinvent her because that wasn't quite working. And then with the United States intervention in World War II, star images were very much, female star images in particular, were very much like the all-American girl next door, the sort of Betty Grable pinup. And Betty Grable was Fox's like pinup queen in the 1940s, blonde, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, the sort of image that would represent what the American troops were fighting for, the woman back home who was waiting for them, and they could literally pin up this picture of this woman on their barracks walls. So Fox had an opportunity to reinvent Tierney in terms that were compatible with the war effort, but it's just a kind of reframing of her sexuality rather than representing a kind of sexual otherness in racialized terms. It's a kind of sexual familiarity where she's the girl next door, she's the pinup. And so in the early 1940s, there's a film, 1942, the same year that the United States enters the war, called Rings on Her Fingers, where she's very much a kind of all-American type. She's like a working class girl from Brooklyn, and there are at least one scene where she appears in a bathing suit, and that became part of the promotional campaign for that film of, Tierney in these swimsuit poses and things like that. And so that, I think, informed the trajectory of her career over the next few years as, a woman who aligned with the ideals of the home front and patriotism, somebody who was directly contributing to the war effort as she was back home, selling war bonds, for example, appearing at the Hollywood Canteen. And so she, stars in a couple of war movies. In Thunderbirds, she's that film, I think, would qualify as a propaganda film. And she's very much kind of playing that type. And so it was a way of, not exactly changing her star image, but adapting the sex symbol from the exotic other to the American pinup that who personified certain ideas about the home front at that time.
And when she comes out of there and it's in the post-war situation, a lot of people view, and I think you make this clear in the book as well, that sort of film noir and the femme fatale is a kind of reaction to that changing image of the woman. It's sort of like, we've had the woman in the workforce, men have been away fighting wars. Do we trust the women have been, suddenly there's gaps and secrets, and we have to take things on face value or not. And she sort of slips into that role as well as the femme fatale.
Exactly. And it's interesting that so many people think of her as a femme fatale via Laura. But much like the movie Gilda, I just taught Gilda in my film noir class, so that's kind of on my mind. Both Laura and Gilda are about women who are presumed to be femmes fatales, but who actually aren't. Laura and Gilda are actually, women who are being manipulated by the men around them, who are kind of casting them in these roles, as opposed to being the manipulator or the sort of siren seducer. But then, after World War II, Gene Tierney does play sort of a bona fide femme fatale in a movie called The Razor's Edge, which is not a film noir, but a kind of post-war male melodrama about a veteran. In the film, it's a World War I veteran played by Tyrone Power, but it comes out right after World War II, so it kind of has that post-war resonance. And she is playing in that film, a kind of straightforward bad, quote unquote bad woman. But an interesting film that comes out right around the same time as Leave Her to Heaven, which, other than Laura, is probably her most famous and well-regarded film now. And it was a huge hit in 1945. And, that film is famous for all the bad stuff that she does in the movie, most egregiously being she allows her brother-in-law to drown while purporting to teach him how to swim. But
her brother-in-law, who is a child,
who's a child, yeah, exactly. He's like a preteen. And he has polio, and she's supposedly trying to, help him, walk again and swim and so forth. And then, there's this famous scene where he drowns, and she kind of sits there allowing that to happen. And, I'm in no way defending the actions of the Gene Tierney character in that film. Ellen Barrett does lots of, that scene in particular is not something that I am endorsing or excusing or anything like that. But I do think that film gives us a kind of like double reading of Ellen, the character that Gene Tierney plays. And I think, on the one hand, you could read it as another bad woman, like the character she plays, Isabel, in The Razor's Edge. But unlike The Razor's Edge, there's a kind of context that the film gives her for what she's doing that I think would challenge the view of her just being kind of bad for badness's sake. I mean, she's clearly disturbed in the film, and there's a way that her disturbed state and also the disturbances that she creates in the film sort of bring to light the sort of boys club world that she's thrust into as Cornel Wilde's new wife, where, he completely ignores her in his sort of, cabin in the woods, which looks like something out of, an old boy's life magazine. He's perfectly content to just hang out with his younger brother and the groundskeeper. And, I don't want to say you're sympathetic to Ellen, but there's a way that Ellen becomes the most interesting, powerful, dynamic character in that film. So she is the center of the film. She's not just there as a foil for the male protagonist like she is in The Razor's Edge, where her badness is set up to show how fundamentally good the male hero is. Whereas in Leave Her to Heaven, her I would call it, more disruptiveness than badness, exposes those kind of contradictions and those tensions in the immediate post-war era of, rechanneling the woman in the public labor force back into the home, and then also kind of taking away some of the responsibilities that, she would be expected to perform in the home, because she doesn't really have an opportunity to do anything in Cornel Wilde's cabin in the woods, and so she's kind of just left to go mad under these conditions, or rather, it exacerbates the sort of psychological state that she was already in.
I don't know. I'm prone to a little bit more of a wicked reading of that film. I think in your book you make a very good point about, you know, her husband being so excited that the brother is in the next room banging on the wall.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, brother, God almighty. I thought we were going to actually get down to doing something here. And now we're going to go out fishing with this guy.
Yeah.
I'm a babysitter now. And I think the film itself sort of does that in that there are a lot of films from this era which it's difficult to read because you're looking back, so you're not necessarily, you're looking at some things with a sort of, oh, this is so Blue Velvet, and this is so
right, yeah,
white fences and all the rest of it, and you're supposed to be looking for the severed ear, you're supposed to be looking for the worms in the undergrowth. So that could be just my perspective, but on the other hand, it just seems like it's so that relationship is portrayed in such a sort of TV fashion, if you like, a sort of straight out of an advertising.
Absolutely.
An advertisement from Life magazine or something.
Yeah.
And then the look of the film, the look of her. See, for me, Tierney's image, and this is just personally to me, the one that is burned into my head is that picture of her on that lake with those colors.
When she's in the white robe and the sunglasses.
Exactly, yeah. Even more so than the portrait, I think.
Yeah.
That just might be an accident of in what order I saw the films, or not necessarily when I saw them or whatnot, but it's a really interesting film. That I love that film. I love her performance.
I think it's her greatest performance. I love that film too. I mean, people always ask me, what's your favorite Gene Tierney film? And, I always want to say, well, the film I would start with is probably Laura, because, it is the iconic role. It's kind of her signature role, but I think her best performance is in Leave Her to Heaven, because it's a much more complicated character. And I also, really love The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, which came out a few years later. And so if I had to pick a favorite, it'd be probably one of those three. But in terms of the performance that I think is the most compelling, I think it's got to be Leave Her to Heaven. And I also, as somebody who grew up, aware of that kind of double reading of seemingly beautiful middle-class life, right? The Blue Velvet Twin Peaks kind of thing. I was sort of predisposed to look for that in Leave Her to Heaven. And I do think it's a kind of like proto-Lynchian melodrama in a way. I think that the people that made the film, I'm not sure what they intended. I'm not sure what John Stahl or Zanuck intended with the film. And much like Laura, there are these kind of competing conceptions of Ellen, the character. And I tried to kind of reconstruct that in the book. But one of the kind of common themes in all of those different attitudes towards her is, whether they realize it or not, I don't want to say siding with Ellen, but there's a kind of fascination with Ellen that all of the people who made that film, and Tierney herself was very proud of that role and really admired the film, that suggests, there's something wrong with this, Life magazine, boy's life, picture perfect view of the vacation home, and Tierney's perverse, disruptive presence, I think, just makes that sort of luridly apparent.
Yeah, and it's like the morality of beauty as well, because it's like, okay, she did a really bad thing, but she's so beautiful. It's like the halo effect. No matter what a beautiful person does, you're willing to give them you're cutting them much more slack. And I even think that the title is right. Exactly that. It's like, I don't want to be the one to throw the first stone.
Well, and it explains why, because if you were to summarize that movie to somebody who had no context for it, they might think like, why on earth would Cornel Wilde's character stay with her? How did he not know that she had done this? And when you watch the movie, you see how he's kind of mesmerized by her, but she has this mesmerizing effect on the viewer, regardless of who the viewer is. I think like there's the immediate introduction of her on the train with the green eyes, the sort of blue-green eyes that match the color of the interior of the train car. It's almost like she's possessed the whole world of the film, whether it's the train car or her costumes are always like, coordinated with her eye color, the back of the moon, greenery, and then finally, after, not to spoil it but the movie's pretty old at this point. I think we can kind of spoil the ending. After her death in the courtroom scene, it seems like she's still somehow from beyond the grave, controlling the environment. That the courtroom has that same kind of, not emerald green, but it looks like the trees in back of the moon. It looks like the train car. It looks like her eyes. So it's hard to read that, seemingly happy ending as a totally happy ending. It's like Ellen is still a force to be reckoned with, whether she's, alive or not.
Absolutely. That absolutely. I could talk all day about this one. It's a really interesting book, and it's a really interesting actress who I think deserves a lot more actor, I should say, deserves a lot more recognition, I think. But I do have to. We do have to close off this conversation. Okay. So I'm going to ask you my final question, which is recommended film, book/books.
Okay, so I can recommend 3 quickly off the top of my head that I read in the last year, all from 2022. For people who are interested in star studies monographs, like my book on Gene Tierney, which is not a biography, but a kind of historical and critical study of like how a star image operates or how a performance creates meaning. I would recommend James Naremore's Some Versions of Cary Grant, published by Oxford University Press, which is a beautifully written study of Cary Grant's performances. It's more of an acting study than a star study, but it offers a view of Cary Grant that is much more multifaceted than the typical view of Cary Grant just playing Cary Grant. Like he's always playing that same sort of charming, debonair figure. Here, Naremore looks at him in screwball comedies, in the darker films with Hitchcock and his Cockney roles, makes a really persuasive case for just what a nuanced actor he was beyond being such a charming personality. So that would be one. Another one is called Immortal Films by Barbara Klinger, which is published by University of California Press. The subtitle is Casablanca and the Afterlife of a Hollywood Classic. So it's not so much a production history of Casablanca, and there's been a lot of work that has done that. It's an analysis of how Casablanca became a classic in the aftermarket through television broadcasts, radio adaptations, home video releases, the Humphrey Bogart cult, and how canons are shaped by these external forces, these agents in the aftermarket that give a film a life beyond its premiere, its initial premiere. And so that's a fascinating film, a fascinating book just about, it's about Casablanca, but also just about how films develop their reputations. And then the last book I would recommend is from the BFI Filmed Classics series that Bloomsbury publishes, and it's the volume on Sunset Boulevard by Steve Cohan. And in some ways a kind of mini sequel to his book Hollywood by Hollywood, which is all about movies that depict movie making. And Sunset Boulevard is probably the most famous, maybe alongside Singing in the Rain, the most famous example of that genre. And so it's a kind of deep dive into that one film in this concentrated way through this lens of Hollywood's mystique of itself.
Oh, those all sound amazing. Those all sound great. I was thinking about Cary Grant and there was something. It's gone out of my head now. I was thinking something about Cary Grant, but that's annoying. Oh well, never mind. Well, luckily, I was also thinking something about Casablanca as well, so I can go straight onto that. The idea that in certain ages you get a like a classic which stands for like an art form, and Casablanca kind of stands for movies. And I was thinking about very recently, I was listening to all of Beethoven's symphonies, and I was thinking, like, when I was growing up, his Fifth Symphony, you know, dum 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 dum, was like the immediate sort of signifier of classical music.
Yes.
If you said classical music to someone, or if there was a comedy scene in which someone had to do classical, that was the shorthand to mean all classical music.
Yeah.
And I sort of like, but nowadays I was thinking, I wonder if that's still the case with Beethoven. I wonder if that's the piece of music that everybody recognizes, because I've got a feeling it isn't. You know, I've got a feeling it's just not that present in our culture as it was like 30, 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I also would think of that as like the stand-in or like the signifier of classical music. But I'd be curious, you know, what my students would say. You know, like if Gen Z has that same sense of classical musicness when they hear that. I mean, and I think that's exactly what the book on Casablanca is about, is how Casablanca came to represent or symbolize classic cinema broadly. You know, like that's the sort of go-to example whenever you have those clip shows, those like Hollywood Hit Parade, AFI, Academy Award montages. You can bet that Casablanca is going to be there prominently, and it's probably going to be the scene at the airport at the end, here's looking at you, kid scene, or maybe the scene in the bar when Humphrey Bogart, is asking Sam to play as time goes by, and so the book is all about that process of cementing Casablanca in our cultural imaginary, but it's through these. It's through its post-premiere circulation. And I think with Beethoven, and I don't know if this is sort of exposing my ignorance of like high art, but I sort of learned about classical music from watching Warner Brothers cartoons as a kid, you know, and so I think I probably learned a lot about, classic films and classical music and the great works of literature from The Simpsons and Looney Tunes, because that's where that stuff got a sense of visibility for a certain generation. And when you're thinking about this at a certain age, those merry melodies.
I think my first ever classical album I bought as a kid was called Voyager, and it was a selection of classical music as heard in commercials.
Oh, wow.
And it was like, Old Spice advert, Carl Orff, and, but I loved it. It had a familiarity to it. And then but you could hear the whole piece of music. So I've remembered my Cary Grant thing, because you mentioned the AFI, and that was what made me think of it. When the AFI were going to give their first Lifetime Achievement Award, Cary Grant was the proposed recipient. And George Stevens Jr., who was the head of the AFI, phoned Cary Grant and said, we're going to give you this award. And he said, well, what does it mean? Because it was the very first one. So he didn't, what does it entail? And he said, well, we'll have this big evening. We'll have all the stars. We'll have all these people that you invite, and they'll give little speeches, and we'll play some clips, and the whole thing will be broadcast on television. And Cary Grant went, oh, I'm very flattered. Very nice. Thank you very much. But no. And it was like, well, why? It's a huge honor. You're going to be the very first. And he said, yeah, but Cary Grant doesn't do television.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting how he talked about himself kind of in the third person that way. My favorite one of my favorite quotes about like movie stardom in general is that line when Cary Grant said, I think in an interview, everybody wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant.
Yeah, because he was Archie Leach, wasn't he?
Exactly. Yeah. And so at some point, like either he did become Cary Grant or Cary Grant became him. And it's just like interesting kind of meta, going back to this idea of the meta levels of a star image. I mean, he's a fascinating case of that.
Did you see, by the way, the documentary they did quite recently
about Cary Grant? Yeah, I have not seen it yet, actually. I think it's an HBO documentary, and I didn't have HBO at the time when it came out, but I do now. So it's on my list of movies to kind of backtrack and catch up on. But it sounded really interesting.
I'm going to watch tonight. On my watch list is a film, one of those gaps I've never seen, Fatal Attraction. Oh,
interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I'll be curious what you think of that, because that has I haven't seen it in a long time. It's probably been, I don't know, at least 10 years since I've seen it, but that had an interesting reception. It's almost like a kind of ink blot test where some people really, going back to Leave Her to Heaven, some people really saw it as like a revenge movie about, men like Michael Douglas, the one night stand. Okay, I'm never going to see you again. And Glenn Close's character then stalks him and his family. So they saw Michael Douglas as the villain. And then other people saw it as this misogynistic backlash against the feminist movements of the 1980s, where we have independent single career woman who is presented as quote unquote hysterical. So it's an interesting, movie to show people and say, okay, who's the real villain in this film? And I've posed that question to students, and they have a mixed reaction. I have never taught the film, but I've shown sort of clips from it. And I once had an older student who remembered seeing it when it came out. And she said, yeah, I would go to parties and people would be like, what are you talking about? Like, Michael Douglas is totally the bad guy in that.
I mean, I know from, I read a book called, Is That a Gun in Your Pocket? About female executives and the sort of powerful people in Hollywood, the executives, the producers, and that film was really developed by quite a powerful backroom team of women.
Really?
Directed by Adrian Lyne, but I think the script is partly written by a woman, if not entirely, and the producer was a woman. And there was a real thing that they were testing the movie, and it was much, much more even-handed, and it wasn't working. And they took out the sympathy parts and made her into more of a villain. So there was a real sense of like, oh, we've got a huge hit, but we've got a huge hit with a film we didn't actually start off making.
Wow, that is super interesting.
Yeah. It's Rachel Abramovitz is the writer of the book. Former guest of the podcast.
Oh, great. Okay. I'll have to go back.
Just to advertise as many episodes as possible, George Stevens Jr., former guest of the podcast.
Fantastic. And Andrew Dominic as well, since you said that you interviewed him, or was that in a different context?
That was in a different context, okay. I'm afraid. He hasn't written a book, so he doesn't get on.
Oh, sure. Yeah, of course.
Very strict. Very, very strict. It's like knocking on the door all the time. Andrew, go away and write a book, then come back. Brilliant. Well, Will, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Likewise.
It's always great. Always great to talk to someone who's so well versed and such an expert in his stuff. A brilliant topic as well, I think.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the compliment, and this was a real pleasure to do. So thank you for having me on the show and spreading the word about the book.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have you on for the next one as well.
I'd love to come back anytime you want to have me.
So that was my conversation with Will. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. We had a great talk about a lot of different things. I will be back next week with a really good episode, a totally different episode, a totally different subject. We're going from Gene Tierney to Godzilla. So if you like all your monsters huge and particularly destructive and Japanese, then I'm sure you'll enjoy the next episode. Until then, please take care.